Imagine an ocean without fear. For billions of years, life on Earth was blind, soft, and peaceful. Creatures drifted through the water like living kites, absorbing nutrients in a silent, slow-motion garden. There were no hunters. There were no victims. There was only existence. But 520 million years ago, something changed. The peace was shattered by a shadow that moved faster than anything else. Evolution built a machine designed for one purpose: to kill. It was a creature that grew to the size of a human arm in a world of inch-long bugs. It possessed a mouth shaped like a hydraulic crusher. It possessed claws spiked like barbed wire. And most terrifying of all, it possessed the first pair of complex eyes the world had ever seen. It saw you before you knew it existed. It struck before you could evolve a defense. This is the story of Anomalocaris, the strange shrimp, the first apex predator in history, and the animal that taught the planet how to scream. The story of how we discovered the world's first super predator is a comedy of errors that lasted for nearly a century. It is one of the most famous and instructive blunders in the history of paleontology, a testament to just how alien and incomprehensible the creatures of the Cambrian period truly were compared to modern life. The mystery began in the late 19th century, in the high altitudes of the Canadian Rockies, within the layers of the famous Burgess Shale. This geological formation is unique because it preserves not just bones or shells, but soft tissue, capturing the delicate bodies of the very first complex animals in exquisite detail. In 1892, a paleontologist named Joseph White-Eaves discovered a fossil that looked remarkably like the headless body of a shrimp or a lobster. It was segmented, curved, and had little spikes on its underside. He named it Anomalocaris, which translates to strange shrimp. He assumed it was the body of a simple bottom-dwelling crustacean that had lost its head. Almost 20 years later, the legendary Charles Walcott found a completely different fossil in the same rock layers. It looked like a flattened jellyfish with a hole in the center, surrounded by a ring of hard plates. He identified it as a jellyfish and named it Patoia. Walcott also found a third creature. It was a large, amorphous blob that looked like a sea cucumber or a sponge. He named this creature Lagania. For decades, these three animals sat in different drawers in museums around the world. They were treated as completely separate species, living in the same environment. The shrimp lived on the bottom, the jellyfish floated in the water, and the sponge sat on the reef. It was a logical conclusion that was completely wrong. It was not until the 1980s that Harry Whittington and Derek Briggs, two titans of modern paleontology, began to re-examine the Burgess Shale fossils. As they chipped away the rock from a specimen of the sponge-like Lagania, they found something shocking. Attached to the front of the blob was the shrimp Anomalocaris, and on the underside of the blob was the jellyfish Patoia. They realized with a jolt that these were not three different animals. They were body parts of one single colossal monster. The shrimp was not a body. It was a feeding arm, a grasping appendage attached to the head. The jellyfish was not a free-floating creature. It was the mouth, a ring of armored plates designed to crush prey. The sponge was not a sponge. It was the main trunk of the predator's body. When they assembled the pieces, the result was a creature that looked like nothing alive today. It was a chimera, a biological Frankenstein that forced scientists to rewrite the rulebook of early life. It was the first time they realized that the Cambrian explosion had produced a giant. To understand why Anomalocaris was the undisputed king of the Cambrian Ocean, you have to understand the revolutionary power of sight. Before the Cambrian explosion, the concept of hunting was primitive. Animals relied on touch, smell, and chemical trails. It was a tactile world where you only knew something was there when you physically bumped into it. Anomalocaris changed the game forever. It evolved compound eyes set on stalks that projected from the sides of its head. But these were not simple light-detecting spots. Fossils found in the Emu Bay Shale of Australia have revealed the microscopic structure of these eyes in exquisite detail. Each eye contained over 16,000 individual hexagonal lenses. To put that number into perspective, a modern housefly has about 3,000 lenses. An ant has a few hundred. The visual acuity of Anomalocaris rivaled that of a modern dragonfly, which is considered one of the most efficient aerial hunters in the insect world. In the murky, sediment-filled waters of the primeval ocean, this vision was a superpower. It gave Anomalocaris high-resolution images. It gave it depth perception. It allowed it to track movement in three-dimensional space. While the trilobites were scurrying in the mud, feeling their way around with antennae, and while the worms were burrowing blindly into the silt, Anomalocaris was hovering above them. It was a silent drone acquiring its targets from a distance. It brought the concept of directionality to predation. Instead of wandering randomly until it found food, it could identify a victim, calculate the distance, and execute a planned strike. This development supports a controversial but compelling idea known as the light switch theory. This theory suggests that the evolution of the first complex eye was the spark that ignited the Cambrian explosion. Once one animal could see, everyone else had to adapt instantly. Prey animals could no longer afford to be soft and slow. To survive the gaze of Anomalocaris, they had to evolve their own eyes to spot the predator, or camouflage to hide from it, or hard shells to defend against it. The eye for an eye principle began here, not as a moral code, but as a survival necessity. Anomalocaris was a giant among dwarfs. In a world where most animals were the size of a fingernail or a matchstick, Anomalocaris grew up to a meter, or over 3 feet, in length. In the context of the Cambrian, it was the equivalent of a blue whale or a megalodon. It was an order of magnitude larger than anything else in its ecosystem. Its method of locomotion was graceful, alien, and highly efficient. Along the sides of its body ran a series of flexible, overlapping lobes or flaps. These were not simple fins. By undulating these flaps in a sequential wave, a motion known as a metachronal rhythm, Anomalocaris could hover in place, glide silently, or burst forward with surprising speed. It moved like a modern cuttlefish, or a manta ray, a rippling shadow gliding over the reef. This propulsion system gave it stability and agility, allowing it to pursue fleeing prey or maneuver through the complex landscape of sponges and algal mats. But the business end of the animal was the head. Those two shrimp-like appendages that had confused scientists for so long were formidable weapons. Each one was segmented, muscular, and lined with sharp, inward-curving spines. These arms were not designed for bludgeoning. They were designed for grasping. The predator would swoop down, extend these arms, and snatch its prey. The spines acted like the barbs on a fishing hook, or the thorns on a briar patch. They would pierce soft tissue and lock the victim in place. Once the prey was secured, the arms would curl inward, bringing the struggling meal toward the mouth located on the underside of the head. And what a mouth it was! The structure previously identified as the jellyfish, Paleontology, is a ring of armored plates shaped like a pineapple slice. Inside the ring were rows of serrated teeth pointing toward a square opening in the center. It functioned like a camera aperture or a garbage disposal unit. The plates could constrict, crushing whatever was inside. For years, the prevailing narrative was that this mouth was the ultimate trilobite crusher. We have found fossilized trilobites with bite marks that seem to match the Anomalocaris mouth, W-shaped chunks taken out of their sides, usually on the right, suggesting the predator might have been right-handed or had a preferred angle of attack. However, recent biomechanical studies have added a fascinating twist to the story. Some computer models suggest the mouth plates were actually too brittle to crush thick, calcified trilobite shells without breaking the predator's own teeth. This has led to a new theory. Perhaps Anomalocaris was a softer killer. Maybe it grabbed trilobites and shook them violently to break them apart. Or maybe it specialized in hunting soft-bodied worms and other arthropods. Or perhaps it was smart enough to wait for the trilobites to molt, striking when their new shells were soft and vulnerable. Regardless of the specific technique, it was the top of the food chain. Nothing hunted Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris hunted everything. The presence of a super predator like Anomalocaris did not just kill individuals. It shaped the course of evolution itself. This is the concept of the Red Queen hypothesis, which states that organisms must constantly adapt, evolve, and proliferate not merely to gain reproductive advantage, but also simply to survive against ever-evolving enemies. Because Anomalocaris existed, other animals had to toughen up. The pressure was immense. The trilobites evolved thicker, calcified armor reinforced with minerals. They developed spines and spikes to make themselves harder to swallow. They learned to enroll, curling into a tight ball to protect their soft underbellies. This behavior is directly linked to the threat from above. A rolled-up trilobite is much harder for the grasping claws of Anomalocaris to secure. Other creatures, like Wiwaxia, covered themselves in chainmail-like scales and grew long defensive swords along their backs to prevent aerial attacks. The worm-like Hallucigenia sprouted vicious spikes along its spine to prevent being snatched. Even the very first ancestors of mollusks began to develop harder, conical shells. The Cambrian explosion was essentially a panic response. The incredible diversity of life forms that appeared in the fossil record during this time happened because everyone was trying to find a way not to be eaten by the giant swimming shrimp. Skeletons, shells, spikes, and speed were all biological innovations forged in the shadow of Anomalocaris. It was the pressure that turned the carbon of life into diamonds. Without this monster to drive the arms race, life on Earth might have remained soft, slow, and simple for millions of years longer. For roughly 20 million years, the group of animals to which Anomalocaris belongs, known as the radiodonts, were the undisputed rulers of the Earth. They were a diverse and successful dynasty that expanded into every niche of the ancient ocean. They didn't just stay as hunters. As they evolved, they diversified into different forms, much like the dinosaurs would do hundreds of millions of years later. Some, like Hurdia, developed massive, hollow head carapaces that extended in front of their faces. These structures may have been used as scoops to sift through the mud, or as hydrodynamic fairings to improve swimming efficiency. Others, like the titanic Egerocasis, grew even larger than Anomalocaris, reaching lengths of 2 meters. But these giants abandoned the predatory lifestyle. They evolved their grasping claws into fine mesh filters, becoming the first filter-feeding giants, the baleen whales of the Cambrian. They cruised the open oceans, sieving plankton from the water column, proving that the radiodont design was versatile enough to support both active hunters and gentle giants. There was also Amplectobelua, a relative found in the fossil beds of China, which possessed even more specialized grasping claws, indicating that different species of radiodonts were adapting to catch specific types of prey. This diversity shows that the body plan of Anomalocaris, the segmented claws, the circular mouth, the swimming lobes, was a masterpiece of engineering that could be adapted for almost any lifestyle in the ancient seas. But no king rules forever. By the end of the Cambrian and into the Ordovician period, the world began to change. The dominance of the radiodonts began to wane. New players were entering the game. The nautiloids, ancestors of the squid and octopus, began to evolve. They developed cone-shaped shells for protection and buoyancy, and crucially, they developed jet propulsion. They were faster and more agile than the undulating Anomalocaris. They could strike quickly and retreat into the deep, outmaneuvering the older rulers. Then came the sea scorpions, or eurypterids. These arthropods brought better armor and stronger pinching claws that could crush harder shells. They were robust, heavily armored tanks that could go toe-to-toe with the soft-bodied radiodonts. And in the shadows, a tiny, insignificant group called the vertebrates, our ancestors, were beginning to develop true jaws and internal skeletons. These innovations would eventually lead to the fish that would dominate the Devonian seas. Anomalocaris was a marvel of soft tissue engineering, but it had limits. Its exoskeleton was heavy, but flexible, lacking the internal leverage of a vertebrate or the propulsive power of a cephalopod. It relied on a hydrostatic skeleton and fluid dynamics that were efficient, but ultimately limited in power. As the ocean became crowded with faster, harder, and smarter predators, the strange shrimp began to lose its edge. It didn't disappear overnight. The radiodonts persisted for millions of years, fading from the apex role to become specialized filter feeders or mid-tier predators, but eventually they vanished from the fossil record. They left no direct descendants alive today. The dynasty of the weird wonders had ended, replaced by the ancestors of the animals we know today. Anomalocaris is the grandfather of all predators. It taught the world that energy could be taken, introducing violence and complexity to a peaceful ocean. Without the fear it instilled, life might have remained simple and soft forever. We owe our existence to this monster. Our ancestors evolved backbones just to survive its gaze. If you enjoyed this trip to the dawn of danger, subscribe to Extinct Echoes and tell us in the comments, if you were dropped into the Cambrian Ocean, what would terrify you more, the alien appearance of Anomalocaris or the silence of a world where nothing has a voice?